Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for being with us virtually tonight. I'm Kristen Rasmussen, the General Manager here at Pages, and I'm joined by our fearless leader, store owner, Linda McLaughlin-Feigl, sitting to my right. This conversation between two esteemed writers and surfers has been a long time in the making for us, and we're so proud and pleased that we could have Thad Ziolkowski and William Finnegan here with us tonight. I've been lucky enough to spend some time with Thad's extraordinary book over the last few days, and I have to say it is very, very hard to put down. But I did have to come into work, so I had to do it a few times. Combining his own story with insights from scientists, progressive thinkers, and the experiences of top surfers and addicts from around the world, he shows us how getting on a board and catching a wave can be a unique and deeply instructive means of riding out the darkness. This memoir is just extraordinary in its explorations and it's utterly honest. I can't wait for these two gentlemen to talk tonight. Really looking forward to this.
And it is an honor to introduce a man who at Pages and amongst this crowd truly needs very little introduction. This is the third time Pages has had the good fortune of hosting Bill, and sadly this one is not in person, but hopefully we'll have that opportunity again before too long, and we'd love to have both of you here. That would be fantastic. Not surprisingly, the other two occasions were standing room only events, which included attendance of some of Bill and Thad's friends and admirers, including author and journalist Michael Scott Moore and Nancy Miller, the founder of the Jimmy Miller Foundation, both of whom are with us today virtually and also good friends of Pages. William Finnegan is a staff writer at The New Yorker and author of works of international journalism. He is specially focused on issues of racism, conflict in Southern Africa, and politics in Mexico and South America, as well as poverty amongst youth in the United States, and is well known for his writing on surfing. That is a bit of an understatement. Not only is he known for his writing on surfing, but he received the Pulitzer Prize in 2016 for his seminal autobiography, Barbarian Days, a staff favorite and constant bestseller at Pages. Thank you for that. And with that, I'd like to just turn it over to Bill and Thad. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hey, Thad.
Hi, Bill.
We're stuck in New York and in New Jersey,
Right.
but we're happy to be on the West Coast, figuratively, talking to people who live at the coast, because Thad's book, The Drop, is as you heard, it's really extraordinary, and he writes about the coast and the surf zone, what he sometimes calls the surf zone crossroads, and what happens in between things. He uses the word liminality and liminal characters quite a bit, and connects up things I've seen them and felt them and experienced them connected, but never really thought about them being connected in the way he argues and dramatizes and really, and this is not a dry book. It's a book full of feeling, and it's about surfing and addiction and what the relationship there might be, the ways in which surfing itself is an addiction, and like other addictions, and I think maybe a good place to start would be just to ask, because it's not the most common term, what do you mean, Thad, by liminality?
Well, liminality is a term that was coined by a folklorist named Arnold van Gennep in the early 20th century. And he used it to talk about borderlands and between tribal areas. So it was neither yours nor mine. It was kind of a strip of land that was a no man's land. And this was often a very scary place, and it was considered sacred too, because it was scary. And he ended up thinking of that also and connecting that to other tribal moments of transition, which often involved a threshold. And liminal comes from the Latin liminis, which means threshold. So it's about the crossing of a threshold, but the really key moment for Van Gennep and later Victor Turner, an anthropologist who took the term up, is about the transition. So a girl goes from being a girl to a woman in a ritual space that includes her, she's neither a girl nor a woman. And it's only after she crosses the threshold that she's a woman, but between the time she's in the threshold or on the threshold, she's neither girl nor woman. And this is a very sacred spot, it's a sacred space in tribal culture. And it's something that Victor Turner transposes to modern culture. And one of the areas he saw as liminal was various forms of entertainment, various forms of ecstasy in secular culture. And I connected it to surfing because the beach and the water just off the beach is such a universally powerful place for people, and everyone wants to be on the coast and have a house on the coast, and surfers occupy that space of the surf zone. So the term liminal for me was one that I appropriated from anthropology just to talk about this zone where you're neither here nor there.
Got it. And just to, I'm going to throw little short quotes at you from your book because it's so provocative. If you could just talk about them a little bit. Surfers are liminal personae par excellence. I mean, you just suggested what you might mean by that, but there's more to it than just the fact that they're between the ocean and the land.
Right, surfers are socially marginal in a certain way that requires sacrifice. You know, they spend their youth typically working, restaurant jobs and, lawn service jobs, construction, in order to be free to surf. And surfing has this relationship to a kind of mainstream economy, which is problematic, right? I mean, you and I were talking a few years ago about a woman whose kid moved to Puerto Rico and would quit jobs all the time when a swell came up, and he was going to be a waiter and he would quit jobs, and she was asking you for advice as to what should I tell him? What should I do with this son of mine who's been captured by surfing? And you and I just looked at each other and kind of laughed. I mean, there was no hope in a way for this boy. He was caught by surfing and that surf addiction, but his relationship to work was one completely liminal. You know, he always wanted to be underemployed in order to be ready to surf,
which is really common, of course.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could say something about how you use another phrase I'm going to throw at you. Surfing is a kind of parable of addiction, and what sort of neurochemically you mean by that?
Yeah, so the book for me was a really eye-opening in the sense of the research. I didn't know much about the brain or neurochemistry or neurobiology, but learning to surf itself is a kind of, epitome of becoming addicted. You know, you have the three factors in addiction. You have novelty, risk, and intensity. And surfing, when you're first surfing especially, it's incredibly novel. It's incredibly demanding physically, so you get all the kind of serotonin and endorphins going. And there's a lot of risk because you're in a foreign element and your brain is constantly telling you, you could drown, you could die, pay attention. And so there's this extremely intense demand on the present, to be present and to survive this experience. So simply learning to surf turns out to be neurochemically very much like acquiring an addiction. And the place of addiction in terms of the place of surfing in terms of it being a parable of addiction is that surfing has all the components of a real drug addiction, but it's also got this kind of compensatory component of, the afterglow and the feel good of the runner's high. And there's the way in which surfing doesn't really drain you and deplete you the way drugs and alcohol do. So surfing has all the elements of addiction, but it's also got some aspects that are very revealing about how you can get attached to an activity that's not, and the activity can be very addictive, but it's not necessarily destructive, right? Surfing gives back. Drugs and alcohol tend to take away without giving back.
You're reminding me now of a line in the book where you're writing about the now appeal of addiction,
Right.
and the sort of flow state that we all hope to, enter when we're surfing, playing tennis, writing, making love, when you're doing something that's just where your consciousness is one with your actions. And the line is, the eternal present of addiction is a zombie version of the flow state. That sounds like what you're talking about. Yeah,
and the now appeal is something that comes up through brain research, which is the breakdown between the communication of like the motivational core, which is called the limbic, and the prefrontal cortex. And what happens with prolonged chronic drug use is that the communication between the motivational core and the rational executive planning of the prefrontal cortex breaks down. And so you have a now appeal where it's like, oh, a line of cocaine or a shot of alcohol, I can't, my brain through the chronic drug use has been made incapable of telling me to wait or to defer. So I'm gonna take the shot, I'm gonna do the line. And in surfing, there's the flow state. And the flow state is of total present moment consciousness, but there's also a sense of flexibility and almost a supernatural attention to detail. So there's the drug addicted state of the now appeal is one of being incapable of deferral and of being swept up in just temptation ongoingly, so that a binge happens or you get completely derailed. In surfing and in flow states in general, in athletics and in experience, it's one of complete master, in a certain sort of like a wall-to-wall consciousness in which it's completely grounded in the present, but there's a lot of freedom and flexibility and a sense of mastery of the present. So both are very much grounded in the present moment, but one is the drug alcoholic state is one of kind of mechanistic, robotic, incapacity to defer. And in the flow state, there's that sense of present moment and everything slows down and there's a kind of mastery of the present moment. Kind of this, to me, that's a great description of these different forms of obsession and different moods, but on the surfing side, you're really describing a good day, right. And those are to be distinguished from all the other days that aren't good. And one of the striking parts of your description of surfing being like drug addiction is your emphasis on unpredictability. Unpredictability of waves when you're out there and you're trying to get good waves, and you may or you may not, and they surprise you pleasantly and unpleasantly all the time. And just the sort of what you call the eternal vigilance and hope, the sort of inability to turn away. That's anybody who surfs or knows a surfer knows that, you are always jonesing. And you're gonna score. People use that term all the time, both drug addicts and surfers, and you really are. There's a wonderful phrase that, and I don't know where it is in your book, when you're waiting for the signal. The ocean will see you now. It's right. it's like you're in a waiting room until you get the signal. And that's another version of the way surfing sort of takes over your life, and it's nothing to do with the flow state. It's anxiety. Yeah, there's something that comes out of behaviorism that's really interesting, which is like where animals are much more able to be focused and on a task, or to be obsessed by something if the reward is actually random or inconsistent. So if I do something and I always am getting a reward for it, my attention to that action will be less intense than if sometimes I get a reward and sometimes I don't. If I go to the beach and growing up, if I went to the beach and there were waves, great. But a lot of times there wouldn't be waves, but I never knew, and now checking the surf cam, I never knew whether it was going to be good or bad. And that absence of predictability is what actually focuses you. It holds you. And the analogy in drug culture is my dealer going to call? Am I going to be able to score? And if I am able to score, will the quality be good or bad or mediocre? Or am I going to get ripped off? And that aspect of drug culture, of street drug culture and the underground, is very much analogous to the unpredictability of waves. And also the ephemerality of the waves.
Yeah.
Of good surf.
You write about a number of well-known surfers who struggle with addiction. I mean, world champions and I mean, very big names in surfing. We've actually lost quite a few people, including a great surfer you write about, Andy Irons, died at the peak of his powers, really. OD'd, and I didn't tell you this, but you shocked me. You were listing various promising surfers and who OD'd, and one of them was a kid I used to surf with, and in Hawaii, and I used to hang around at his house. He lived with his mom. We kept our boards there, and he was a wonderful surfer, a guy named Tommy Winkler, and then I moved away, and then suddenly, like 19 or 20. We were told that Tommy went to Colorado and had a heart attack while skiing. Well, that's apparently not what happened. You report here that he OD'd. Well, that wasn't what, I mean, you and I both know, I think, so many people who went down that drain. They had an obsessiveness about surfing, and the sensation you get from it. And they couldn't resist this other version, the zombie version of the same thing.
Yeah, no, there are a lot of surf culture and surf stories are tied up in drug culture and drug addiction, and yeah, it's incredible. Winkler was someone I knew about only through surf history, like Matt Warshaw or something. He comes up as an early example of an overdose and a death by overdose. But yeah, no, it's pervasive, and there's a lot of surf culture that encourages it. The whole go for it, set your line, the whole value in surfing of commitment is of, you jump in with both feet in surfing. You're not rewarded for hesitation in surfing. You're not rewarded for half stepping. And in drugs, there's the surfer who comes to drugs is going to bring surf values to that. There's going to be a way in which there's a go for it attitude. And, someone like Hackman talks about, in a very subtle and refined way, talks about the relationship between the rush of heroin and the rush of a 25-foot wave at Waimea. And he says, there's a sense in which the potency of both is very analogous. It's very similar. A 25-foot wave and an injection of heroin has a potency that's very tempting to say, well, that's a lot alike. But he said, actually, the analogy breaks apart pretty easily. But where it doesn't break apart, for him, during the long years when he was a drug addict, as he said, was my whole notion of commitment. Of setting a line and going for it all the way. That was what he felt the surf culture and the surf values that kind of made being an addict a natural extension for him of who he was as a surfer. They grafted on seamlessly into addiction.
Yeah. And with lots of people, it's, they had their heyday as great surfers. And then there's the next act, which may be, working in the surf business or something. And that was true for Hackman for many years. We're talking about Jeff Hackman, a great big wave surfer in Hawaii in the 70s. And and yet that second act does not include the rush and the sort of, you know, adoration that you become used to. Tommy Carroll, I mean, really suffered when that was over, and really struggled with addiction. There's a to push in a little further into the neurochemistry of addiction. You write that, well, a couple of different things I want to bring up. One is that you say the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection, and how people out of isolation become addicted. I should add that there's plenty of your own experience with drug addiction in this book, and it's extremely vivid and informative and dramatic. But you also say that the brain, I mean, the sort of common view of drug addiction is not correct. I'll quote from your book: the brain is not a passive hostage of hard drugs, but rather a wily, independent entity that resists. This is, I mean, that is the common conception of drug addiction, and this, you know, opponent process, as it's called, was kind of a revelation to me.
Yeah, that was a revelation to me too. I mean, the common conception of the brain is, and this is a phrase you see a lot in drug addiction writing about the brain, is that hard drugs hijack the brain, and the brain ends up being kind of bound and gagged and taken away into drug addiction. But in fact, there's another version of the brain which comes out of bioevolution, which is that the brain was evolved to be a kind of pattern predictor, and so the state the brain wants to be in order to respond to experience and to survive is one of neutrality. And anything that threatens neutrality is going to be dampened and countervailed by various neurobiological processes. That's why they're called opponent processes. So if you get high, or if you fall in love really precipitously, or you have a really violent grief, there's going to be a neurochemical countervailing. Why? Not because the brain is against love or grief, it's because it's disturbing the clarity of the neutral perception of the world, so that you are being made vulnerable to being picked off by an animal, or starving to death, you know, in the case of grief, or various other forms in which you would not survive. The brain's main job is to keep us alive. And how it does that is to keep us in a default state of neutrality and clarity of mind. So as soon as you get high, the brain is figuring out how to countervail that. Where are you? What are the smells? What is the chemistry? How can the brain start to anticipate a pattern, so that you'll start to feel an opponent process before you even enter the bar, because it knows where you're going by the pattern of your heading for cheers, you know, to get your shots. It's not just that you acquiring a tolerance for the drug. That's also part of an opponent process, but it's that the brain is trying to anticipate the high or the disruption.
It really is a more dynamic idea of the brain's relationship to getting high and to drugs than I'd seen before, and kind of exciting to think about. That the brain has this disposition to take care of the person who owns the brain. And
you and I were talking before about how compulsive it is, for how universal the impulse to get high or to get drunk or to get altered was.
Yes.
And we were saying, well, if the brain is all about neutrality and survival, why is there this, why is it so commonplace for people to be looking for a way to get high and to disrupt the brain? And one of the things you see with surfers who become addicts, and perhaps people who become surfers, is that they have experienced, some degree of trauma in childhood. So there are these things that addiction researchers call adverse childhood experiences. A violent alcoholic father, we were talking about how common a figure he is in the life of hardcore surfers, especially, and hardcore surfers who become addicts, but just any kind of, all the kids we knew growing up. And for me personally, I was an example of this. Kids coming from a divorced family. I had a kind of, ominous, scary stepfather, and I felt safe in the ocean relative to the home place. The ocean was my refuge, right? And I bonded with surfing with an intensity that had to do with the countervailing effect of surfing as an experience, but also the community of surfing. It felt, and this is one of the things you see a lot with surfers, they'll say, like, I felt relatively, safe and secure in the ocean, which is most people consider chaotic and scary, right? And so that recipe for attachment, not only to surfing, but also to drugs and alcohol, is a very common one for surfers.
And there's the way that learning to surf, becoming competent, you get comfortable in this chaotic zone, this crossroads, where this sort of natural violence is kind of the attraction, and breaking waves that's why we're there, and you sort of master it over time. I mean, there's, no matter how good you are, how long you've been at it, how much you like big waves, you'll get scared here and there, but in general, you've mastered the emotions. You're comfortable in the water. You think you can take care of yourself and surf well, and that has a kind of, I don't know what the parallel is with addiction there, but it's a big part of what keeps you going back. I mean, yeah, they're the thrills and spills, the danger and whatever, but I feel like having mastered this and having, the brain is happy out there, we got this.
Yeah, no, there's a kind of in bioevolution they call biophilia. We're happier among lots of species. We come from the vast preponderance of our ancestral experiences, one of being in wilderness, surrounded by lots of different other species. So when we enter the ocean, we're in wilderness and we feel at home because that's our ancestral home, right? Far and away more millennia in the wilderness than in agricultural areas or in cities. But there's also that at homeness that you feel, because, I mean, I feel absurd sometimes when I'm going surfing. I'll feel like, as I'm putting the board in the water, I'll think, what else do you know how to do better than this? This is like the thing I know better than anything, partly because I think I learned so when I was a boy before other things, but also because somehow I think there's that sense in which it's like an important skill that I am happier about having mastered than any other skill. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah. And it's I mean, you're quite accomplished in other areas, perhaps better known as a writer than you are as a surfer, but I do know what you mean. And it's strange though that to be more practical about how to manage the addiction of surfing. We both know plenty of people who haven't managed it very well. It can destroy relationships, certainly careers, families. It can be really hard on someone's life. But then in the passages in this book, or in the whole section where you move away from surfing and you go to graduate school, and you're into drugs, but you're at Yale and you're making your way to your PhD, you're really doing the other thing, you're doing well. You again describe yourself, I'm a graduate student, I'm liminal, I'm in the shadows, and I'm lowly like a surfer. And it's a startling description, but then anybody who's been around graduate school will probably say, oh yeah.
Yeah, there's a way in which that's an unexpected thing. It's like you're invisible, you're lowly, you're an apprentice. I mean, for me also, when I started surfing again, it was a way for me to get sober, or it turned out to be the way. It was something to get in shape for. I could quit drinking and smoking and doing drugs in order to be ready to surf, right? In part because I simply could not be ready to surf. And it had come back into my life and started somewhat to take it over again. I mean, I remember an experience where my brother, who is quite a bit younger, moved to Kauai from Kansas with some hippie kid friends, and they were there. And he's like, "You got to come out here." And I'm thinking, yeah, I really need to come out there. And I was teaching in New York. I had gotten a tenure track job, and I thought, no, you really need to drop all this and go to Kauai. You need to go surfing in Kauai and leave everything behind. And it was very hard for me to manage the recursion of surfing in my life for a while. There were moments where I really felt actually threatened by its resurgence as an addiction that was both good and bad. And that's where I start to feel like it's a parable of addiction, because it really does have a face of it, which is truly like a destructive addiction, but it also has a very salubrious afterglow kind of, radiantly wholesome aspect. Cocaine addiction, alcohol addiction, there's no radiant wholesomeness to that, right? It's not there on that end of the spectrum. But surfing has a component that is similar to the alcohol and cocaine addiction, right? The addictions are a spectrum. They're not really cleanly divisible in that way. And that's why I find surfing so interesting, is that you get the examples of people who are completely derailed by it. And I feel every time there's a good swell come up, I feel on the verge of being derailed, because I come out of the water and I'm kind of like, well, what are you doing living in New Jersey? You can't, like I grew up surfing in Florida, and I feel very challenged by the brutally cold months in Jersey to surf. I mean, I defy most people to go surfing when it's getting dark at 4 p.m. and there's snow on the ground and you've got to drive an hour to the beach. So I'm thinking like, you really need to change your life, right? Every time. And it comes up, it crops up. It's not something I've resolved. I don't feel like surfing. And that's an example of the way in which surfing is a parable of addiction, because it disrupts as well as it, soothes and gratifies, right? It's disruptive. And if the surf had been really good on the morning of, my son's graduation recently, I would have been very torn. I'd be like, well, it's only junior high. I didn't go to a graduation ceremony for junior high. The waves are coming up. I'm going to go surfing. But it would have been hugely controversial in my family. Everyone would have been aghast, right?
Yep. There's also, I mean, if you're trying to hold down a job and be in family, I mean, surfing turns you into a liar. I've found, maybe you managed to avoid this, but I'm always lying to my editors. Nobody should transmit this to them, saying, "Oh, well, I just got, I got to do a couple, and what I'm really doing is I'm disappearing to go surf because the waves are coming up. And I'll work all night, don't worry, I'll make that deadline." But lots of ducking and dodging. Actually, since Barbarian Days came out and did well, it's not so disreputable. But for many, many years, I've been working at the New Yorker since the 80s. I couldn't say, well, no, I can't. No, I'll talk to you tomorrow. And because I'm going surfing. Now I can say it. They say, "Oh yeah, that's that thing he does that, that has
I mean, there's a romanticizing of that kind of addiction on the part of non-surfers about surfers. They kind of fondly, yeah, you're going to go surfing. Of course you're going to go surfing. And what are you doing living in New York? You should be living in Hawaii where you can surf. But when they start to actually experience someone not showing up because they're going for surfing, then they lose that romantic affection for it as a type.
Yeah. I feel like you've been way out on the edge of sort of the cutting edge of sort of neurochemical research with this book. There were so many surprises to me in there, and I wonder if you could say something about what was the most. You said you hadn't known much about the brain till you started this book, and I wonder what the sort of most surprising or things other people probably don't know was that you came across in your research.
Yeah, I mean, I was reluctant to accept the brain explanation for my experience as an addict, because I wanted, I mean, I think one of the things that happens when you have to get sober is that ultimately it is not a brain function. Ultimately, I think getting sober is a spiritual decision. It's one in which you have to summon, in a way, your soul in order to truly get sober and to make that very difficult decision, which I think it is a decision. And it may be being made ongoingly. In my experience, it feels like it was more or less, several moments of deep decision making. So as a humanist in that way, I didn't want to know, I didn't want to hear all the materialist claims about my brain. But so for me, the big revelation was that it was so powerful a presence, just in the neurobiology, how plastic the brain is, like an octopus, shifting and changing colors, and all the synapses and all the ways in which it's constantly reacting to experience. That fundamental vision of my brain as this, permutating thing that's so sensitive and so continuously changing was the primary revelation. But I mean, second, I said, I think we talked about this earlier, the very idea of opponent processes and the doomed nature of the whole project of getting and staying high, which I think, most addicts, and I think this is true for surfing too, when you get high, you want to stay high, that disco and never come down. There's a very strong impulse to stay, as high as you can stay. And that is what's absolutely ruled out by the opponent process. Our entire central nervous system is completely against that. That's not happening. It's impossible. And in the book, I say, well, if I had known that when I was in the midst of my addiction, would that have changed anything for me? And I don't think it would have. And that's why I think that, I intellectually get all of that research, but I don't think fundamentally that's going to change it. It's interesting. It blew my mind, but I don't think I think it would have influenced me at some level. And now the notion that my central nervous system is against the whole project of getting high helps me, be more, it adds something to my sense of resolve, but that's about it, but intellectually speaking, I was blown away by basically everything I learned about the brain, because I knew nothing really going in.
But still, that's a fantastic description of it. It reminds me of something you write, where you refer to the promiscuous law of neuroplasticity. And that law is what fires together, wires together. Right.
The brain has no moral agenda. The brain, that's why such horrible things can happen with people and addiction, is because the brain, once it gets dysregulated, it's simply going to fire in that pattern. So gambling addiction, sex addiction, shopping addiction, any of that is going to, you think, well, how can this be happening? But if it fires together in a certain way, if the brain gets dysregulated, it will happen right until someone walks off a cliff. There's no saving anyone, unless you kind of stop doing the behavior and your brain can recover. The good news in terms of neuroplasticity is that the brain can also be rewired. It's not over. So, and this is also, you see with PTSD, the great thing about surfing and post-traumatic stress syndrome for someone like a war veteran whose brain is playing the trauma over and over in a way that's absolutely intuitive for me. I mean, I was almost blown up in my tank. I can't stop thinking about it. And I'm having nightmares about it when I sleep, and I'm thinking about it all day. The brain was so threatened by that experience that it's trying to figure it out. It's playing it over and over. If you take that person and put them on a surfboard and they're ragdolled underwater during a wipeout trying to learn to surf, they come up and they're actually that whole compulsive pattern of the brain has been disrupted. Just for a second, they come up and they have they get up on the board and maybe they catch a wave, and that little gap in the repetition is a moment where the brain is getting rewired and refiring, and it gives a rewritten right? The script of the brain is being rewritten. The brain is flexible enough to recover from PTSD if it gets a break. But what can you get a break from? It doesn't work to take drugs, although a lot of wounded warriors are drug addicts for obvious reasons. But there are things like surfing that can break that, and that can start to have a new pattern of experience. The brain is always open to new experience. Yeah.
You write about people taking up surfing, addicts taking up surfing, people trying to sober up or deal with trauma, and adult learners, people. You mentioned you learned to surf as a little kid. I did too, and I kind of grew up with the idea and still somewhat hold it, that that's the only way, because you'll never get any good if you don't start really young. Mm-hmm. But you write about the kind of narrowness of that view, and what adult learners can expect. I mean, they're not going to rip, but they can get a lot out of it, including a lot of healing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that surfing is benefiting from all of these culture workers who take it up through yoga or whatever, the kind of lifestyle surfers. And you see that there are shades of ability and shades of commitment, and that the fundamental thing that reveals to me is just that the importance of the ocean as a field of play and of playfulness, and to get away from the kind of rigid, hierarchical, taskmasterish sociology that we grew up. When you come up in a classic arc of learning to surf, you're kind of hazed, and you go through a period where you're a kook, and then you master it, and then you're a journeyman. You don't need to worry about it anymore. And that whole thing gets disrupted and suspended by the adult learners, because they don't have the time, or maybe even the neurological ability anymore, to learn deeply all the kind of muscle memory things that you need to learn as a surfer. But it's all right. It turns out,
this for surfers is revolutionary. Adult learners are all right. We're so used to clawing our way up the pecking order in the lineup. Mm-hmm. Are there some questions coming in? I see some faces that suggest there are. Linda?
We wanted to start you guys off with a couple, Thad, if you'll let us ask a few, and then anyone who's listening tonight, if they want to put a question in the chat or Q&A, raise a hand. There's lots of different ways to speak with Thad or Bill, and we'd love to hear from you guys. So please, please feel free. Can I start with one, Thad? Is it okay if I jump the line? So I really enjoyed so much at the beginning of the book where you talk about going out with your two children, who were then, I think, was it 6 and 10? Is that right? Something like that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And how they, your daughter especially was just so fearless, and that was such a sweet, wonderful chapter. And I was really curious if the kids have kept up with this, if they've developed a love of the sport.
Yeah, I mean, we get down. They get down there so inconsistently with me that they're more and more comfortable with it. But there hasn't been a moment where they've kind of like, I've got to go to the beach. I've got to surf. And I think if we lived in a surf town, that would probably happen. But as it is, there's so many gaps between their experience, and
right.
It hasn't actually hooked them yet.
Yeah. Do you think is it something you look forward to and welcome, or are you a little skittish about it?
I'm ambivalent about it, but I love being in the lineup with them, and I love just hanging out in the water with them. I definitely worry a little bit about the power of surfing to overtake their lives,
mm-hmm.
Especially in terms of school, because I was such a mediocre, terrible student due to surfing. I mean, it was partly due to just being a kind of a jock and not very interested in being a boy. But I mean, it really had a lot to do with surfing. And I was very close not to going to college. And I think it would have been fine. But I as someone who got so interested in languages and so interested in academics, it amazes me that I managed to get an education at all. And I felt like I had to stay in graduate school for 8 years just to compensate for the 8 years where I didn't pay attention at all.
Right. I gotcha.
I worry about that.
Right. That's sure. As a parent, you would. I get that completely. I had another question from there's a few people here in the store that are listening in because we're here, that store's open. And one of the questions was, how has the book been received among people in the addiction recovery world? I mean, I know it's just out today, but with the pre-reads and people that have, read it, what's the reception been?
Well, I had an enthusiastic reception from a podcast called What You're Craving. That was the first real recovery reception I had, and that was great. And that might be something people would enjoy listening to. It's called What You're Craving podcast.
Okay.
But beyond that, I haven't really gotten much feedback yet. It's early. It's just out. So I'm curious though about that. I wonder about how applicable it seems. It's so difficult to see surfing from the outside for me, like what this book looks like to someone who's in recovery, or thinking about trying to get into recovery, but doesn't surf. Like, well, I don't know.
Right.
How do you do that?
Right. How that translates. Right.
How it translates, whether it translates,
Right. All right. Anyone else have a question? We're going to look at, let's see. No.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody who has a question, please go ahead and put it into the Q&A or the chat.
Let's see. So Alexandra Smith sent a note. Hi, Alexandra. She says, they say you don't wind up with the person who's right for you, but the person who is familiar to you. And hearing Thad say he felt more comfortable in the chaos of the ocean is sort of tantamount to that. If your home life is chaos, then the chaos of the ocean feels more like home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add to that is that in one chaos, I felt like unsafe, but in the ocean, I actually felt oddly safe. So the experience qualitatively was really different. And that's what's so attractive about the water and the ocean to someone who's coming from a disrupted life, is that, there's a sense in which the laws of nature feel just. Laird Hamilton talks about this too. If you're getting hit by a wave, it makes sense to you. Whereas if you're getting hit by people, it doesn't make the same kind of sense. There's a kind of rational irrationality to nature that is soothing, that is also something you can kind of feel like you understand and you can, to some degree, master. And that's satisfying.
Right. It's a very different thing.
Yeah.
I would be remiss, Bill, if I didn't ask you if you're working on anything, because we, as Linda said, sell Barbarian Days by the case, and would love to know what you're working on next.
Well, I'm sort of churning out pieces for the New Yorker. I just wrote a big thing about horse racing, which has made me very unpopular in the world of thoroughbred racing, I'm told. But it was really interesting to report. And I continue to write about politics for the magazine. But my next book is going to be kind of memoirish, it turns out. There's a space in the story I tell in Barbarian Days where I just mentioned, and then these years passed and I worked on the railroad, saved some money, and away we went surfing. People have asked about that, including my publisher, and I started talking about these years I spent in California as a freight brakeman on the railroad, and it was quite an interesting time and place. And I'm interested in rail, trains, as transit policy. So it's a mix of argument and memoir, and history at this point. It hasn't all come together yet, though. Doesn't even have a title.
So Thad, I know, fiction, we are familiar with Wichita. That was a book we sold well here. And this is nonfiction, a very personal memoir. Curious to know what you're working on. Well, it's probably premature to ask that, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was advised to start working on something right away during the rollout of the book just to keep my sanity. And I started working on a literary thriller about a surfer. So that's what I'm working on. I don't know if it'll actually ever survive or make it to the end, but that's what I've gotten interested in.
I would venture to guess that it would survive and thrive here at Pages. So let's hope it comes to fruition. And we would like to have both of you here in person to celebrate that publication. One of the things Kristen and I were speculating on, and maybe you could talk a little bit, how you two know each other. What's the personal connection between the two of you?
I first encountered Thad through his memoir, On a Wave. And I wrote a short review for the New Yorker of it. It was actually the first really good literary writing I'd ever seen about surfing. And I've been sort of paying attention for a long time, and it's not to diss other people's work, but it was a cut above anything I'd read. And so there was that, but did we meet around that? I don't think so. Yeah. Well, did you get in touch and say, hey, thanks for the good review?
Yeah, no, I mean, the review was anonymous. And so you wrote me a letter saying I was the one who wrote that. And, I really enjoyed your book. And then Bill took me out to Montauk and introduced me to Montauk. I'd never been. So that was the, yeah.
I remember we ran out there on a hurricane swell.
Mm-hmm.
Good hurricane swell.
Very good.
Yeah.
Ditch planes, right?
Yeah, well,
not
we
exactly
went somewhere else, but yeah.
So we have a question here from Andy Dallenbach, and I'm saying, knowing what you do about the therapeutic effects of the ocean and surfing, are you at all surprised that there are now over 80 organizations in the surf therapy space? Have you ever participated in a group ocean therapy session?
Yeah, I write about that. Toward the end of the book, I have a chapter on surf therapy, and I had a great experience with the Jimmy Miller Foundation at Camp Pendleton. I write about that. I write about going to a session for on-spectrum kids with a group called A Walk on Water, AWOW. And yeah, no, these were very moving experiences. And I'm not at all surprised there are 80 surf therapy organizations in existence. That makes perfect sense to me. I thought I was blown away by my experiences at those two places.
You've articulated so well why they make so much sense. I think that is just a soundbite that will resonate with me for a very long time as a non-surfer. So thank you for making that connection.
Oh, thanks.
All right. Any other questions, Bill, that you have?
Well, I'm kind of glad we've ended on this surf therapy note, where I mean we've really tarnished the name of surfing up and down for the past hour. It's just like addiction, it's heroin, it's coke, and yet in the book, I mean, when Thad says I had a neurochemical bias, I was disposed toward surfing, he realized it right away. And that's how it was for me. I think how it is for a lot of people. But this idea of people coming in not to, become the next greatest surfer around, but for something else, something much healthier ultimately, because it doesn't take over your life to the same extent. I'm glad we've got around to that, which really is booming. I haven't been involved with it, but I see groups and hear about groups, and I hear from groups, and it's booming on this coast as well as the West Coast.
Yeah, the thing that the surf therapy brings to surfing that's pretty new is altruism, like the whole getting out of the hedonism and the pure self-centricity of surfing to give back to other people through surfing is really interestingly, like it redoubles the pleasure in a funny way that I never would have anticipated. And is very, very powerful in that respect. Sharing surfing with people who need it therapeutically is incredibly pleasurable and powerful in a way that completely like discombobulated my values about my understanding of surfing. Yeah.
So
Right,
we
the
have-
ultimate useless thing to do turns out to be useful.
Yeah,
which
the
is-
ultimately selfish thing to do turns out to be selfless.
Which is a very poignant end. I agree, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask a question that is, I think, burning amongst many Pages readers, and it popped up in the Q&A, and that is, what is your favorite wave in the world? And I think we should pose that to both of you.
Oh, yeah.
It's a tough one, you know. I've traveled around and surfed a lot of different waves and had different favorites at different times. You know, the kind of overpopulation of surfing is a big problem for surfers. That is, great waves tend to get really crowded. And so there's, you know, your old favorite place, which is now too crowded to surf. And places change. One of my favorite waves was in Indonesia, and then there was an earthquake and it became a different type of wave. More exciting to some people, but scary to me. All that said, I'd probably say Honolulu Bay on Maui, which is now horribly crowded, but it was part of my heyday to live there and surf that wave.
I mean, and for me, it's just anywhere around here on a good hurricane swell when the waves are good. The beach
Like right now.
breaks in New Jersey shift a lot, but there really is something so sweet to be near your familiar beaches when the surf is really good. And so ultimately, to be honest, it's not something exotic, but something really local that I have the greatest pleasure in. But where that'll be year to year is hard to say.
So to quote our good friend, Michael Moore, and we kind of, he said, fabulous way to end it, gentlemen. And I think he was referring specifically to the ways in which surfing is giving back in these therapeutic opportunities. So
Thank you guys so much. This was a terrific conversation. That is so nice to meet you. And we're so excited to have your book here at the store. It's called The Drop. And we have a big stack, and that was nice enough to send us book plates. So we have signed copies. And of course, as we said, we sell Bill's book all day, every day. So thank you so much. It was such an honor to be in conversation with both of you tonight. So thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for having me.
thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks
Thanks,
everyone
Bill.
for joining us.
Be around, Thad. Bye-bye.
Good night,
night.
guys.